Hello everybody, John Greenwood here. Today I am celebrating the channel hitting 1 million views on YouTube by doing a quick little Q&A. CLTC Thugonomics says, given that Sam explicitly mentions in A Feast for Crows that the Maesters have likely inflated or fabricated the chronology of the Age of Heroes, noting that the list of Lord Commanders is shorter than the 998, do you think the unbroken 8,000-year Stark lineage and some houses is a strategic fabrication by the Citadel to create a false sense of stagnant stability in Westeros? First of all, this is a great question, and I like that you included a bit of evidence behind your question. That makes it a lot easier for me to answer. And yeah, I think you have a really good point here. I'm not sure if you got this from somewhere or if this is an original thought, but yeah, I would be inclined to say that you're probably right, that the Maesters are fabricating things, because the claim that the Lord Commanders have like 1,000 of them doesn't really seem to align with all of the evidence that we have. And in terms of the number of the Stark Lords, like, we don't have the exact number of Stark Lords, but it seems to be pretty clear that there aren't 1,000 years worth of them in the crypts of Winterfell. We only have evidence for like a few hundred years of them. I mean, they are old, but I don't think unbroken 8,000 year Stark lineage is really a truthful claim. So yeah, this is the kind of critical thinking that I think the fandom needs more of, and that's one of the reasons that I continue to make my videos. So great question. Yeah, I think you're on the right track. Sinfan is asking a question here that kind of gets to a very common question that I get, which is basically like, how much of this do you think is planning versus how much of this is just like plot holes or us reading into things too much that, you know, he said the curtains were blue and we're making a whole case out of it. I've answered this question many times before, but basically there's this concept called the death of the author in literary analysis. It's a term coined by a French essayist, but the important thing is basically, you know, the work needs to stand on its own, and so the author's intentions really have nothing to do with it in terms of interpretation. I mean, you could, you know, do that for yourself if you wanted to, but the way that I analyze things and that most of academia analyzes literary works nowadays is ascribing to the death of the author standard, and that the text itself is the main authority on the text. So I don't really care if George got up on a stage and said, the sky is actually neon pink in Westeros. All of those times that I said the sky was blue is an error. Obviously, there are errors in a book like this. It's just an inevitability. And, you know, you run into them sometimes, but a lot of them can be resolved by just looking at the text itself and realizing that it is an error in the text itself and not needing to rely on these external things. Something that I think would really help the fandom and would be pretty trivial for them to set up, them being like Random House or something, is kind of like an errata for changes, right? Particularly with Dance. There's a lot of like first printings of books that are floating around that have all of these errors inside of them, some of which were corrected in subsequent reprintings and some of which are not corrected in subsequent printings. But I think a lot of people still have like the first printing of Dance because they printed a lot of copies of that. And so I think it would be helpful for them to issue an errata. You could post this online somewhere, and this would basically just be for the fandom, right? That kind of thing I think would be really helpful, and it would help assure the fandom that the things that they're reading aren't like an error. It would kind of like quash this kind of question, like, is it an error or is it not an error? If we had an errata, then, you know, it would be no problem because we could just look at the errata, and if it's not in the errata, then it must be intentional, right? This happens all the time with like rule books. So I'm a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, and Yeah, like it's kind of the same thing with D&D, right? Basically, everybody buys the book when it first comes out. They do a big print job of most of the books for the opening sales, and then they just kind of dip into inventory to keep selling books until that's done, and then they need to do a reprinting. And they ran into a similar kind of issue where they were like, okay, is this a deliberate design choice, or is this an error? Is this a typo? Is the number like too big? Do we need to change things for balance purposes? And, even as far back as like third edition, I think, there's an errata of changes. I think they may have even issued erratas as far back as Dragon Magazine. This is all going to sound like complete gobbledygook to people who don't play Dungeons and Dragons. But, yeah, an errata, I don't know. It seems to me like the most obvious solution. I don't think you would lose any money publishing an errata, just like saying chapter whatever, Septon Chael should be Septon, whatever the Septon's name is, at the wall, for example. And then that would clarify, like, no, that actually is supposed to be Septon Chael, or no, that's supposed to be the other Septon. I don't know if they've corrected this kind of thing in subsequent reprintings. I have the first printing all the way back from when I bought it in 2011. So why am I going to buy the book again? And errata would fix that issue. It would take no time at all. In fact, it would be considered probably new A Song of Ice and Fire content, and George could just churn this out in like an evening with a bunch of his minions and put something out, and then he could say, well, I wrote the errata, so I have written something on the book series in the past 15 years, and then, he would kind of get it off his back. I think it would be very helpful to do it, but of course, that's just my thinking. What do I know? Dr. What is saying, who do you think tried to kill Tyrion at the Blackwater? More on his own, Cersei, Joffrey, Littlefinger, or Bloodraven? That is a really fascinating question, and I think I might spend a live stream looking into this issue once I'm done with the cat's paw. I don't know. I have so many things on my list that are like interesting questions. So the one thing I'll say is I don't think it was Cersei. It might have been Joffrey. Might have been more on his own. Might have been Littlefinger. I'm not too sure. It definitely stinks to high heaven of some kind of scheming here. These two questions I kind of paired together because they kind of get at the same thing. So Sean was asking, what has driven your deep curiosity for Gurm's fantasy world? You've made the most in-depth and logic-driven breakdowns of the series I've seen everywhere. And then Duncan Oreos is, what is the process of how I go about answering these questions? So I think I'll answer Sean's question first and then Duncan Oreo's question second. My curiosity for Gurm's world is, I think, born out of the text itself, because the text kind of encourages you to think critically and think in this way. For all the people who do not ascribe to Death of the Author, Gurm himself has stated pretty plainly that he intentionally wrote the series in this way, in a way that encourages you to think critically, in a way that encourages you to scrutinize all of these details, right? The inherent structure of the book, if we're ascribing to Death of the Author, like pretty explicitly encourages this by having multiple point of view characters who have different perspectives on the same event and sort of clash with each other. And so it naturally sort of invites you to compare, right? We have a lot of characters who are at the Blackwater, and there's a little bit of mystery on what was going on there. And so it sort of naturally invites you to take a look at the different perspectives of that event and sort of try to piece together a more objective view. I don't know if an objective view is necessarily possible, but you could probably get pretty close to an objective view by examining as many different perspectives as possible. And yeah, this is something that George has really talked about in the past, so I think it's just the nature of the series. And then to answer Duncan Oreo's question, this is one of the things that I go over on stream, so you'll want to watch one of my live streams to get a sense of like how I practically do this, because like I actually do all of this stuff on camera, so you see me from very inception to like my conclusion all on live stream. to answer the question as shortly and succinctly as possible, how I start theorizing about something is basically I just start asking why. I write down details that are happening in case they become relevant later, and I also write down questions that I have in case they aren't answered, or maybe they are answered by a detail that I write down later. And so, I kind of figure out things that way. If something is included in the text, let's say, for example, George writes that the curtains were blue. Okay, so I can write down a note that says, okay, so the curtains in this scene are blue. And then I ask myself, why? Why are the curtains blue? Is this some sort of reflection of the theme? Is there some sort of meaning behind this color? Or is it just because, this house's sigil has like a blue background or something, and it's just kind of coincidence that it's blue? There's a lot of things that end up becoming coincidences and don't really lead anywhere, but sometimes you'll note down a detail and it'll lead somewhere interesting, like the green sails. Why are the sails green? And then to answer that question, I have to go through a different little list of questions, right? I have to go like, okay, well, when did this sort of happen? Who has green sails in this universe? Is that just sort of like a generic sail color, or does it, identify somebody specifically? And then once you go through that, you start learning things about green sails. Yes, they are unique sails. Okay, so if they're unique sails, then who has green sails? Okay, the Lyseni have green sails. Wait a minute, who was in charge of the Lyseni at this time? Oh, it's Salladhor Saan, right? And now I'm like, okay, wait a minute. So why is Salladhor Saan involved in this scene here, right? Why is his ship carrying Daenerys? And then you kind of get into more questions, and you start building a theory from there because you asked questions and you scrutinized the text. It wasn't immediately apparent why the sails were green, but once I sort of went through it methodically and I looked at all of the evidence and I answered all the questions that needed answering, it turns out that Salladhor Saan is involved in whatever sort of scheme is going on here, right? Salladhor Saan carried Daenerys as a child, and Viserys. I'm going to assume that they were on the same ship for the sake of whatever theory this is, and that's kind of information that you can use to build off of other things. And you only get those kinds of answers once you start asking questions. So basically having a skeptical mind, having a mind that works through things methodically, who challenges assumptions that are held, who challenges evidence that we have, and really takes the time to ask questions and do your best to answer them. And that's kind of the process that I go through when I'm reading the books. So note, these ideas don't really come out of the blue. They mostly come because I asked a question or somebody else asked me a question that really made me think and go, how do you ask questions that nobody has asked before? It's really simple. Most of the time you just ask questions, period, because I think a lot of people just take this series at face value. So asking any questions at all usually creates an original question, and then finding answers in the text to back them up. It's just a matter of reading the right chapters. Collecting and categorizing evidence is an ongoing issue for me, and it's pretty difficult. And then in terms of script writing, again, this is something that I've done on camera, but basically there's no real secret. You just kind of do it. So that was a really long-winded answer, but I hope it answers both of your questions. Larboga has said, George said he regrets killing one character. Who do you think it is and why? Contrary to some other theorists, I assert pretty strongly that it is not Quentin Martell who he regrets killing. I think the more obvious character who he regrets killing is Aemon Targaryen, Maester Aemon, from the Wall. He dies either in Braavos or on the ship once he leaves Braavos. In any case, he dies of pneumonia, and basically this puts George in a really tough spot because he's the only character alive in the world who really knows answers to certain questions and can give this information to other characters more naturally. And so now he's in a position where he kind of has to do like a quadruple backflip to get the answer to certain people. You know, maybe he can still think up of ways to get these answers in the right places that they need to be in, but he's made it a lot more difficult for himself just to kill this guy off for the emotional impact or something, I guess. Yeah, so I think Aemon is the character that he regrets killing. Shaman Up 7 says, could Meryn Trant be working for Varys? After rereading Kevin's chapter, I noticed some weird consistencies with how he receives the news to go see Pycelle, with no letter delivered or shown, removing the possibility of a written message, and the boy outside not speaking, presumably being one of Varys' mutes, as he does not speak once during the chapter, even after being addressed by Kevin, where courtesy would dictate he thanks him, removing the possibility of oral delivery. It seems the only possible way the novice would know the news could be by Trant telling her, with the boy being a signal to Trant that it was time to act. Yeah, this is a pretty good theory. I like this one. I don't know whether Trant is working for Varys. It's definitely a possibility. It would change my view of Trant. It hasn't really been on my radar, but yeah, it's kind of a good point. How was this information delivered? And sort of harkening back to the question that I answered earlier, like just asking this question at all, you know, being skeptical about this. This is the kind of thing that I think the fandom has been sorely missing, and we just kind of take it at face value that this message was given when George is like freaking out behind his computer and he's like, how do I make it clear to these people that they shouldn't take things at face value? I don't know. Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know the answer, but it's definitely something to look into. It is suspicious, and I think you're right that it's a question that needs answering. Israk asks, why do so many people believe Varys' lies, even though he has a nickname of the Spider and the Master of Whisperers is his official court position? I don't know, Israk, you tell me, because there's many people in the fandom who believe his lies, even though I've pointed them out. So, I mean, that's just a question for the broader fandom. Clearly, people in the books are not unrealistic in believing his lies, because the fans who have basically omniscient knowledge of the series believe his lies as well. And, like, again, he lies 90% of the time. Even if you think I'm off on a few of the statements that I marked as deceptive, like, even if you don't trust the exactness of my statistics and you think maybe I got a few wrong or something, you know, marked a few entries as lies even though they shouldn't be, like, the point is that the overwhelming majority of the statements that Varys makes are still gonna be lies, even if you assume I got a few wrong. And I just think it's so ridiculous that people still believe Varys after I pointed out a bunch of his just complete lies. And they're just so obvious once you're skeptical. I really just think we need to be more skeptical and actually think about things, which involves asking questions. Sometimes it seems like a very obvious answer, but once we try to answer these questions, the answers don't really make sense. Like, how did Meryn Trant know that Kevin was wanted at the Rookery? It seems like it's an obvious question. Oh, well, the boy must have told him, but that's not really a satisfying answer because the boy's mute. So what, he knows sign language? So then Meryn Trant knows sign language? Even if we assume that Meryn Trant does know sign language, that makes him kind of suspicious, doesn't it? It would seem to imply that Meryn Trant is an asset because he would have no other reason to know sign language other than to communicate with Varys' little birds. I don't know, Israk. It's a very good question. I don't think I have an answer. Good at Happy asks, how far do you think Varys' web of actions goes in what he has influenced? This is an ongoing question that I think about and that some fans in my Discord have been trying to figure out. We've been trying to, map out his broader network, but that is a really deceptively simple question. And what I mean by that is that it's like not so easy to answer, and I don't really know. I guess generally speaking, it goes way, way further than what the fandom seems to think right now. Like every time you look at something, Varys tends to be more involved, and it's become a little bit of a meme at this point. But like, if there's evidence for it, I mean, evidence is evidence, and that goes for people like disproving me as well. There's a lot of people who have disproven parts of my theories, right? Parts of my theories I get wrong sometimes, and then I have to be like, yeah, no, that's a good point. I think I'm wrong on that. So, it happens to me too. But, if there's evidence in favor of Varys being much more influential than we previously thought, it's kind of ignorant for us to just stick our heads in the sand and say, well, no, the question is settled. I think a lot of people read these books like 15 years ago, and they just kind of like are vibing off of their memories of the book. And every time somebody actually opens up the book, like on my Discord, for example, they'll be like, oh my God, Varys is here too. And they're just seeing Varys everywhere now that I've opened a lot of people's eyes to it. We're seeing that it grows more and more, right? We've got Varys, we've got Baelish, we've got Illyrio. Now we have Salador San as part of the plot as well. It's looking like a few other characters, minor side characters were part of the plot as well. It's just an open question of how far it goes. And, we've got time. I don't think Winds is coming out before 2030, so we got plenty of time to figure out how far this network goes. Nick Bottom is asking, other than A Song of Ice and Fire, what are your favorite books, both fantasy and non-fantasy? I guess right now my favorite book, if you had to push me, would be The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. It's a French book, but there's English translations available. A lot of people see that the full version of this book is like 1,000 pages, over 1,000 pages, and they just kind of like disregard my recommendation after they look at that. A lot of very pretentious people online are going to say that you have to read the full version of this book. Having read both the full version and abridged versions of this book, I think it's perfectly acceptable to read an abridged version, and I'll give my recommendation for an abridged version now. I've read a few different versions of this. I haven't read the most recent abridgments or translation of this, but in terms of the ones that I have read in English, I have a translated and abridged version by Lowell Bear, published by Bantam Classic. I believe it's a 2003 printing of it, and that one was pretty darn good, very modern and easy to read, and it's pretty short. Let me see the page count here. It's only like 530 pages, so they cut about half of the book out, and it works fine. The thing about Alexandre Dumas, this is going to make more sense to like anime fans or something, but he's kind of like an anime guy where there's definitely like beach episode filler stuff that aren't really necessary to the plot, and you can cut a lot of that out. The main thing that you're looking for when you're looking at an abridgment of The Count of Monte Cristo, like if you're looking at different versions, is that a lot of the abridgments will cut out the entire Italy arc. So in the book they go to Italy for a bit. Italy is just super duper important in terms of plot, but mainly for like the thematic messages behind the book. Super duper important. Also, Italy is where the protagonist does his most aura farming. So I mean, like, this is just critical stuff here. So anyways, the Bantam Classic 2003 edition, Lowell Bear, I don't know if I pronounced his name right, but I would recommend that one if you want to get an abridged version of that book. If you wanted to get your feet wet in philosophy, a great place to start is Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. I have a new translation by Gregory Hayes This is the 2003 Modern Library paperback edition, and it's pretty good, much more readable than some of the more antiquated versions. I also appreciated the sort of preface and introduction that they have. But basically, Meditations is one of those books that you're not supposed to binge read in one sitting, like an Agatha Christie novel or something, which I also read and I find very good. Agatha Christie is a pleasure to read. You're kind of meant to almost binge read an Agatha Christie novel, like in a sitting or two. Versus Meditations is something that you're supposed to pick up like once a day and maybe read like a page or two and kind of sit with it and think about it. I suppose you could binge read it. It's only like 200 pages ish. But the main value you get about Meditations is reflecting on the Stoic thoughts there, and it's sort of an easier entry into Stoicism than a lot of the more modern stuff. In terms of fantasy, this is going to be very controversial on a Song of Ice and Fire channel, but A Song of Ice and Fire is not my favorite fantasy by far, actually. I like Lord of the Rings more than I like A Song of Ice and Fire, and I also like Ursula Le Guin more than I like George R. Martin. So my favorite fantasy, A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. My printing is from 1988. So this is a pretty old book, but it's really good. The thing I like about The Wizard of Earthsea is its prose. I think that the prose in this book is just so beautiful. And before I read this book, I really was not aware how beautiful the English language could be. I really can't sing the praises of this book enough. It just feels right on the tongue when you read the pages aloud. And it's difficult to explain to people who aren't native speakers of English just how good the language feels in this book. The plot is relatively simple. This isn't the kind of book that Game of Thrones is. There's not a lot of intrigue or anything. This is a book about feelings. So it's just a completely different kind of book. But you can see clearly, if you read this book, that Ursula has inspired George pretty heavily. And in terms of what I think the White Walkers are sort of about right now, I think I would be sort of spoiling things, but there's a lot of answers that can be found in Ursula Le Guin, and I'll leave it at that. And then finally, Better Bros 2 asks, are you still considering writing a book or a story? Would you want to write a sci-fi or fantasy story? And what would be your major inspiration for such a story, i.e. if it's sci-fi or fantasy? Yes, I'm still considering writing a book or story. I'm currently still writing it. As of the date of recording, the book is at 40,000 words. That's 40,000 words. A novel is typically 70,000 words. A fantasy novel you could expect to be more than that, at around 100,000 words for like a fantasy epic. So I might be halfway done-ish. I don't really know. My beta readers are very patient giving their feedback, because man, sometimes I turn in a chapter and the beta readers, they just tell me, man, John, you really messed up on this one. This is just no good. And there have been times where I've had to rewrite an entire chapter, just scrap pretty much the whole thing and just go back to the drawing board. And I think if I wrote the whole thing like from start to finish without that kind of feedback, it would be a real stinker. So I'm very thankful that I have the platform that I have to really have beta readers who have stuck with me the whole way through so far. So shout out to my beta readers. You know who you are. Hopefully it will be finished before the Winds of Winter. That's kind of the bar for me. So I don't know. I've been at it for 3 months and I seem to be almost halfway done. So I don't know if I'm going to take a break from it for a while or something. I write once a week on Friday nights instead of going out to drink, basically, because gas and beer has become really expensive here. So saving a lot of money and becoming very productive, basically. So yeah, the inspiration behind the work right now is a lot of the books that I just listed. So, yeah, along with Game of Thrones, of course. Anyways, hopefully that has answered most people's questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but this is all that I have time for, really. I think retention is probably plummeted through the floor by this point. So I'm just going to end it here. This has been John Greenwood, and hopefully you enjoyed this Q&A, and hopefully I can get some more videos out soon. Anyways, take care.